Hey friends, it's your teen and tween librarian, Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. I'm very excited because I learned something new for this episode. Last week we saw Axel and the gang travel through the lava tube and into a new area that contained geologic matter, we'll call it, rocks and fossils that Axel identified as coming from the Silurian period. Having not done very well in my geology classes in college, I had no idea what that meant. So I looked it up, and I think it's really cool because the Silurian period comes from the Paleozoic era. It's actually kind of in the middle of the Paleozoic era, as you can see here, and it was actually the smallest, the shortest amount of time it was 433 million years ago to 416 million years ago. I might have those numbers off, but it was a short period relatively. That's still like 15, 20 million years right there. That's quite a few. But for some reason, those rocks and various fossils are easily identifiable. There's something very unique about that period. Now, the Paleozoic era is an important one, and I'm kind of excited about learning about this. The end of the Paleozoic era is when the Earth sees its biggest extinction event in all of its history. That's the big one, the big asteroid or whatever that killed off most of the world's plants and animals. And it wasn't for about 30 million years into the Mesozoic era, which followed the Paleozoic era, that we saw plant life and animal life spring back. And the Mesozoic era has some names that you might be recognizing. It starts with the Triassic period, then the Jurassic period, and then the Cretaceous period. So I have a feeling the fact that the Paleozoic era has already popped up in this book in the Silurian period makes me think that there's going to be something important about that later on. So I learned a little bit about geology, a little bit about Earth's history in more detail. But we'll see what else this book teaches us along the way. Also, your Icelandic lesson for the day, I have also been pronouncing another phrase incorrectly. Now, Icelandic has a really interesting part of its alphabet, the double L. The double L does not sound like how we pronounce it with just the L sound. It does not sound like the double L sound in Spanish where you add a y to it. The Icelandic double L is more like a TL. So instead of saying salvertu, which is what I was saying for the greeting, which is like, hi there, it's sætlvertu. Sætlvertu. Can you hear that sound? Now, is my accent correct? Probably not. Sætlvertu. There's another instance where you see that double L, which I also was mispronouncing, in the word Jokul, which is what I thought I was saying correctly. You can see it spelled here. Like in German, which is one that I know okay, the J is with a Y sound, but there's that double L at the end. And instead of Jokul, I should have been saying Jokul. Now, it's hard because at the end of the word, you don't have a way to end it like sætlvertu. It kind of flows into it. But Jokul, you have to kind of finish it there. Now, I'm not sure if that's exactly the way. I researched it a lot, but it's probably one of those things you have to practice a lot to sound really good at it. So give it a try. It's not an easy thing to say, but it's kind of cool once you figure it out. Jokul. Jokul. Over there, kind of on the side of your teeth. Jokul. Anyway, that's your Icelandic pronunciation for the day. Let's get going into chapter 20. Enjoy. Chapter 20, A Dead End. It was indeed essential for us to ration ourselves. Our stock of water could not last more than 3 days, as I realized that evening at supper time. And unfortunately, we had little hope of finding a spring in these Silurian layers. The whole of the next day, the gallery unfolded its endless series of arches before us. We walked on almost without a word, as if Hans's silence had infected us. The path was not rising now, at least not perceptibly. Sometimes it even seemed to slope downwards. But this tendency, which was very slight in any case, could not reassure the professor, for there was no change in the nature of the beds, and the transitional characteristics were more and more obvious. The schist, limestone, and old red sandstone sparked magnificently in the electric light. We might have imagined that we were passing through an open trench in Devonshire, which had given its name to this sort of ground. Specimens of magnificent marbles lined the walls, some of agate gray, capriciously streaked with white veins, others of crimson, and yet others of a yellow splashed with red, while further on there were dark-colored griots relieved by the lighter hues of limestone. Most of these marbles bore impressions of primitive organisms. Creation had obviously made considerable progress since the previous day. Instead of the rudimentary trilobites, I noticed remains of a more advanced order of creatures, including ganoid fishes and some of those saurians in which paleontologists have detected the earliest reptile forms. The Devonian seas were inhabited by a vast number of creatures of this species, and deposited them in thousands on the newly formed rock. It was becoming obvious that we were climbing the ladder of animal life in which man occupies the highest rung. But Professor Liedenbrock seemed to be taking no notice. He was waiting for one of two things to happen: either for a vertical shaft to appear at his feet, down which he might continue his descent, or for an obstacle to arise which would force us to turn back. But evening came without either expectation having been realized. On the Friday, after a night during which I began to feel the pangs of thirst, our little band set off again along the winding passages of the gallery. After 10 hours walking, I observed that the reflection of our lamps from the walls was greatly diminishing. Marble, schist, limestone, and sandstone were giving place to a dark, lustreless lining. At one point, where the tunnel was becoming very narrow, I leaned against the left-hand wall. When I took my hand away, it was quite black. I looked more closely and saw that we were surrounded by coal. "A coal mine!" I exclaimed. "A mine without any miners," replied my uncle. "Oh, who knows?" "I know," retorted the professor curtly. "I am positive that this gallery driven through these beds of coal is not the work of man. But whether it is or isn't is all one to me. It's time to eat. Let's have supper." Hans prepared some food. I ate scarcely anything, but drank a few drops of water which comprised my ration. Half the guide's flask was all that remained to slake the thirst of 3 men. After their meal, my 2 companions stretched out on their rugs and found in sleep a remedy for their fatigue. But I could not sleep, and counted the hours until morning. At 6 o'clock on the Saturday morning, we set off again. 20 minutes later, we reached a vast cavern, and I then realized that this mine could not have been dug by the hand of man. If it had, the ceiling would have been shored up, whereas in fact it seemed as if only a miracle of equilibrium was holding it up. This cavern was 100 feet wide and 150 high. The ground had been torn apart by a subterranean disturbance. Yielding to some powerful jolt, it had broken asunder, leaving this huge hollow into which human beings were now penetrating for the first time. The whole history of the coal period was written on these dark walls, and a geologist could easily follow all its various phases. The beds of coal were separated by compact strata of sandstone or clay and gave the impression of being crushed by the upper layers. At that age of the world, which preceded the secondary period, the earth was covered with vast stretches of vegetation, and the product of the dual action of tropical heat and constant moisture. A misty atmosphere enveloped the earth, screening it from the rays of the sun. Hence, the conclusion that the high temperature then prevailing was not due to the sun, which may not even have been ready yet to play the brilliant part it now acts. There were no climates as yet, and a torrid heat equal at the equator and at both poles was spread over the whole surface of the globe. This heat came from the interior of the earth. Despite Professor Liedenbrock's theories, a violent fire was blazing in the bowels of the sphere, and its action extended as far as the outer layers of the Earth's crust. The plants, deprived of the beneficent rays of the sun, produced neither flowers nor scent, but their roots drew vigorous life from the burning soil of this early period. There were few trees, only herbaceous plants, tall grasses, ferns, lycopods, sigillarias, and astrophylites, belonging to families which are now rare, but at that time contained thousands of species. Now it is to this exuberant vegetation that the coal measures owe their origin. The as yet elastic crust of the earth obeyed the movements of the liquid mass underneath. Countless fissures and depressions resulted, and the plants, sinking beneath the surface of the waters, gradually formed huge accumulations. Then, natural chemistry came into action. In the depths of the seas, the vegetable masses were turned into peat, to begin with, and then, under the influence of the gases and the heat of fermentation, were completely mineralized. Thus were formed those huge beds of coal which, despite their size, the industrial nations will exhaust within 3 centuries unless they limit their consumption. These reflections occurred to me while I was considering the mineral wealth accumulated in this particular portion of the earth. These beds, I told myself, will probably never be worked. The exploitation of such deep, out-of-the-way mines would be far too costly. Besides, why should anyone attempt it when there is still plenty of coal just under the surface in a great many countries? So these beds will doubtless remain as they are now, intact, until the last trump. Meanwhile, we were pressing on, and I was probably the only one who was forgetting about the length of the journey in my absorption in geological considerations. The temperature remained more or less what it had been during our passage through the lava and the schist, but my sense of smell detected a strong odor of protocarburet of hydrogen. I immediately recognized the presence in this gallery of a considerable quantity of that dangerous gas, which miners call fire damp, and the explosion of which has caused so many dreadful catastrophes. Luckily, our light was provided by Ruhmkorff's ingenious apparatus. If we had had the misfortune and imprudence to explore this gallery with torches, a terrible explosion would have put an end to the expedition by annihilating the explorers. This journey through the coal mine lasted till evening, with my uncle scarcely able to restrain his impatience at the horizontal nature of the path. The darkness, which was always complete 20 yards ahead, prevented us from estimating the length of the gallery, and I was beginning to think it would never come to an end when, all of a sudden, at 6 o'clock, the wall unexpectedly appeared before us. To the right, to the left, above and below, there was no way through. We had come to a dead end. "Well, so much the better," cried my uncle. "Now at least we know where we stand. We are not on Saknussum's road, and there's nothing we can do but turn back. Let us take a night's rest, and in less than 3 days we shall be back at the place where the paths fork." "Yes," I said, "if we have the strength." "And why shouldn't we?" "Because tomorrow we shall have no water left." "And no courage either?" asked the professor, giving me a stern look. I did not dare to reply. And that's the end of chapter 20. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what's happening at the library by visiting us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always just go to the library's website. I hope to see you again for the next episode of Bedtime Stories, but until then, be well and sleep well.